Hello. Now, this lecture is oriented more to the endocrine system than to lab safety. I just want to make that clear. Normally, this is the same content that you would be getting if you were in a classroom-based lab presentation. And with that, let's move forward. I'm going to skip the lab safety protocols, the safety equipment location, etc. We are going to take some time to review the gross anatomical structure of the endocrine organs of the head, neck, thoracic cavity, and abdominopelvic cavity. We are going to review the microscopic anatomy of various endocrine organs. Now, if you see there it says complete the worksheet for pages 357, 358, no worries. What I've done is attach in the Blackboard, in the same file area or near it, to the endocrine audio lecture, basically the sheet. And what you are to do before the end of the week, not necessarily the end of the class, but the end of this week, is complete the worksheet, make sure that it's in PDF form, okay, PDF format, and basically upload it at the site. All submissions for worksheets have to be submitted by 5 p.m. Friday, the week that they are produced. Okay? Let's talk about hormones for a few minutes. Now, basically, if you have your lab exercise book with you, you can follow along. And I'm going to go through all the sections necessary. But basically, when you look at the hormone, the term is a Greek term, to provoke or set in motion. Hormones are released by the endocrine glands. These are glands that are referred to as ductless, D-U-C-T-less. In other words, there's no duct, there's no portal, there's no little tube leading it out. So basically, the hormones are released outside of the cells, so into the extracellular fluid, and they are transported by the bloodstream. Basically, they are there to influence target organs or target cells. A release hormone, otherwise known as release factor, is usually hormones released by the hypothalamus to trigger the release of pituitary hormones. For example, a thyrotropin-releasing hormone triggers the release of thyroid-stimulating hormone from the pituitary, otherwise known as TSH. A stimulating hormone is a hormone released by the pituitary, though, and that's to cause the release of another hormone at the target tissue. So in this case, let's go back to the thyroid stimulating hormone. This hormone will cause the thyroid to release T3 and T4. Now, this diagram here, I expect you to be very familiarized with it. The location of the organs, the location of the glands. Particularly, we're going to go over the parathyroid, pineal, hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid, adrenal, and to a point the pancreas. The other glands, such as the ovary and testes, that'll be in the reproductive lab later on in the course, as well as digestive tract, kidneys, thymus, and heart. When we talk about the gross anatomy of endocrine organs in the head, first off, we are mentioned the pineal gland, which is located at the roof of the third ventricle. This gland releases melatonin, which is involved with regulating the sleep-wake cycle. The hypothalamus, which is now considered really the master gland, is located inferior or below the thalamus in the brain. Why I say the term master gland is actually, for many years, it was thought that the pituitary gland, with its variety of stimulating hormones, etc., was considered the master gland, but then it was found out that the hypothalamus really controls the secretion of a variety of the hormones released by the pituitary gland. Now, in the hypothalamus, they will produce various releasing hormones and inhibitory hormones, such as GnRH, CRH, TRH, and GnRH. They also produce, they have several nuclei there that produce antidiuretic hormone, otherwise known as ADH or vasopressin, and oxytocin. But the actual release of those hormones is through long axons of nerve cells that originate in the hypothalamus, but at the end they terminate in the posterior pituitary, where their release there will go into the bloodstream. Now, pituitary gland connected to the hypothalamus via the infundibulum, that's that stalk-like structure. It's a stalk of nervous tissue, and this is located in the bony depression of the sella turica, that is the pituitary gland. Also, the hypophyseal portal pathway. This is a capillary network connecting the hypothalamus to the pituitary. It allows the transport of releasing hormones to reach the pituitary. And really what it also does is prevent the dilution of that releasing factor. Because basically at concentrations far lower than what you need minimally could be easily achieved if you just had the direct delivery of the the hypothalamic hormones, if they went directly into the blood and went throughout the entire circulation. So what you're really doing is producing extremely powerful but extremely small amounts of these various releasing hormones. They travel down a very, very short capillary pathway, a portal pathway, and then basically are released back into the pituitary cells, and from there they act on the pituitary cells, okay, to release the various stimulating hormones. And here you can see this. You have basically the hypothalamic neurons. They synthesize antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. You'll notice that there's two nuclei there, okay? The hypothalamus itself will release regulatory hormones that travel down this portal blood pathway. The hypothalamus will also control via the preganglionic motor fibers of the autonomic nervous system. It will act on the adrenal gland, particularly the adrenal medulla, which will release epinephrine and norepinephrine at a 4-to-1 ratio. Notice the long axons here from the hypothalamic neurons that eventually terminate here in the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and that is where you get ADH and oxytocin released into the circulation. The regulatory hormones travel across via this little capillary pathway, and they act on the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. The interesting thing is that the anterior and the posterior structurally are somewhat different. This is more glandular, the anterior lobe. The posterior is more neural in its appearance. Now, we have the two sections, actually somewhat three, that's a bit of a debate, of the pituitary. We have the anterior, which is the adrenal hypophysis that contains endocrine cells that release hormone-stimulating factors such as TSH, ACTH, FSH, LH, GH, and prolactin. By now, you should be familiarized with the abbreviations of these different stimulating factors, and if you're uncertain of anything, always have your textbook handy as you review these unique factors. The posterior part of the pituitary, the posterior lobe, is referred to also as the neurohypophysis. This is an extension of the brain. The axons from the hypothalamus end and release ADH and oxytocin at this particular structure. Also, there's an intermediate little strip of tissue called the intermediate part. It's referred to as also the pars intermedia. It's between the anterior and the posterior lobe. Usually it's inactive, but it has the capability to release melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH, and that is extremely important in a few unique cases. Here we see more of the portal, hypophyseal portal system here. Notice that you've got an inferior hypophyseal artery here that has a small capillary bed here which receives oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone into this capillary bed and takes it away by the hypophyseal veins. But then you've got the much more important one right here, the superior hypophyseal artery, which first off has a capillary bed right around here where the neural secretory neurons from the hypothalamus release or basically discharge the releasing factors, releasing hormones, into the blood. But then notice that it's a very short pathway then by these portal vessels, which then break off into another capillary network here to basically pass on these releasing hormones into the cells of the anterior part of the pituitary, okay? And you've seen this chart before. Interestingly enough, it provides you a broad variety of the hormones that have been found to act in a regulatory manner. And if I may add, you have to keep in mind something that's very important here. This too could change. It could get even more complex. We would find other functions for a variety of some of these pituitary hormones, etc., and how they also act on various target organs and tissues. Okay. Now, after we've gone through all of the structures in the head, we have to move into the neck. There we have the thyroid gland, which is inferior to the thyroid cartilage. The organ is structurally consisting of a left and right lobe that is connected by an isthmus, a smaller amount of tissue. It's all thyroid tissue. Basically, the thyroid gland is involved with the production of thyroxine, which is referred to as T4 because it has 4 iodide ions or iodide atoms attached to the molecule, and then TRIIODOTHYRONINE, and that's basically T3. Again, in T3, you have only 3 iodide atoms attached to the molecule. These regulate cell metabolism, general growth and development, and normal development and function of the nervous system. Also present, cells that make calcitonin are present, that reduce the calcium ion levels in body fluids, such as plasma, blood. The parathyroid glands are very small, pea-size, there's 4 of them, that are embedded into the actual thyroid gland. They produce a different hormone, parathyroid hormone, PTH, which increases calcium ion levels in body fluids. Here you see the basic structure here. Here you have the thyroid cartilage. Here you have a rich blood supply coming up and down here through the common carotid arteries, okay? And you can see the veins taking away the hormones, the arteries feeding this organ of the thyroid. Here is the left, and you have the right, and you have the left lobe, and you have that isthmus in the center, okay? Now, moving from there, if you look on the other side of this organ, you have the parathyroid glands, and they're tiny. There's a little point to bring up here. The parathyroid glands, and actually, in part, the thyroid gland itself, doctors were able to understand things after a while, because what they first would do is they'd notice that the blood calcium levels would go all crazy after they had had a patient have a thyroidectomy. And it was removal of the thyroid. Now, this may seem difficult, but really makes sense, because you're going to have calcitonin there, which alters the levels of calcium ions in the blood in one direction, and then you have PTH, which alters the calcium levels in another direction, okay? When we move out of the neck, we're going to go into the endocrine organs of the thoracic cavity. 2 of them of prominence, thymus and the heart. The thymus gland is posterior to the sternum. It produces thymosins. Now, these are hormones that promote the maturation of T lymphocytes. These are a type of white blood cell, which we'll get into in another class, in another lab soon. Also, you have the heart, which is located in the mediastinum, and it produces natriuretic peptide. Now, natriuresis is the excretion of sodium in the urine. As the muscle wall of the heart, those cells are stretched during increased blood pressure. The hormone is being released. Actually, the hormone is released not only by the ventricular muscle, but by the atrial muscle, but a little bit less. The hormone acts on the kidneys so that it will increase the excretion of sodium and water. You see, if you increase the excretion of sodium in water, you reduce the blood volume, hence you will reduce blood pressure. Here we have the thymus, and you can see how this is located. It's kind of over on top of the trachea to a point, but it's definitely inferior to the thyroid gland. This eventually, by the way, the thymus will be after puberty really begin to shrink and decrease its mass. By the time you get to about middle age, you really have nothing left but connective tissue and a little bit of fatty tissue, mostly fibrosis. It loses its efficacy as we get older, okay? Beneath the thymus, though, is the heart. And there is where you have some very important hormones, I should say really a hormone, and that's natriuretic factor being produced, okay? And by the way, this is an interesting point, sidebar. Around the time that they were actually discovering natriuretic peptide, there was a big debate that occurred, and part of this was because we were just in about, in 1984, about mid-80s, coming to see that, wow, we can have someone who has a weakened heart and replace it with a mechanical heart. And Barney Clark was the first patient that received a fully mechanical heart, but he lived only about 600 days. And they literally had said, had they not done this, he would have died perhaps the next day had they not done the surgery, because his heart was so weakened that it was literally coming to pieces in the surgeon's hands. But here's the point. The researchers were discussing cardiovascular physiology, and they said, maybe getting rid of the whole heart may not be the best move, because we're losing an organ that produces also a critical hormone that's important in homeostatic balance for sodium and water levels in the blood. And since then, there's been some discussion about it from time to time. Gee, maybe what we ought to do is leave the heart, but try to have some sort of assistive device next to the heart to do the pumping for mostly the systemic circulation. But we'll move on forward as we continue this lab. The endocrine organs in the abdominopelvic cavity. The stomach and the small intestine produce several hormones to regulate digestive activities. The key ones you want to keep in mind are gastrin, cholecystokinin, and secretin. We will go into this much more in depth down the road when we get into the digestive system. The pancreas is located between the curve of the duodenum, which is the beginning of the small intestine, and the spleen. And you need to locate on, let's say, a diagram or such, the head, the body, and the tail of the pancreas. But the pancreas is a dual organ. It is both exocrine and endocrine. The endocrine aspect is via the patches of cells, the clusters of cell on the exterior, called the islets of Langerhans, otherwise known as pancreatic islets. They release, for example, glucagon. This is from the alpha cells of the islets of Langerhans. Glucagon elevates the blood glucose levels by promoting glycogen breakdown, the synthesis of glucose from fats and proteins, and the release of glucose into the blood. Insulin lowers the blood glucose levels by promoting glucose uptake by body cells, as well as stimulate glucose storage as glycogen in skeletal muscles and in liver. As you can see here, here is the pancreas. You can see how it's located, all right, around this kind of curve of the duodenum. And it actually is endocrine by the islets of Langerhans, as you see here. It's exocrine because each of those lobules deliver into a ductwork, which will eventually deliver a mixture of bicarbonate ion solution as well as digestive enzymes, and it will be released into the duodenum for digestion. Let's take a look here. Notice the pancreatic acini. These are the cells that are producing the exocrine secretion. The endocrine is produced by these cells. Now, Please do not panic. I'm not going to ask you to look at a slide and say, which one of these cells is alpha cells or beta cells? That's tricky. That's when you really need immunohistochemistry for that. And you would stain for particular proteins present in the various cells. Alpha cells produce glucagon. Beta cells produce the insulin. It is the delta cells that produce somatostatin, and the pancreatic polypeptide cells, the PP cells, will produce that unique protein hormone called pancreatic polypeptide. That's all you need to know right now. Further, the endocrine organs in the abdominal pelvic cavity include the adrenal gland, which consists of the cortex. This is the outer layers, and they produce steroid hormones. And the medulla. That's the inner core structure that produces epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, the cortex produces steroid hormones to regulate sodium and potassium levels in the body fluids, manage glucose metabolism, as well as produce androgens. These would be considered male sex hormones, but interestingly enough, the androgens coming from this cortex can be used by females, and they are biochemically altered to estrogens. Now, the medulla, the cells look completely different. They're more neural-like. They will release epinephrine and norepinephrine during the sympathetic stimulation. This is in a 4-to-1 ratio. And one of the other things is that they've actually taken a look at these cells, which are called chromaffin cells, put them in with a nerve growth factor, and they start sprouting axons, which really indicates their neural, basically ectodermal development. But we'll get into that when we get into development later on in the course. The kidneys, these are under the stimulation of PTH. They release calcitriol, which acts on increasing calcium and phosphate absorption in the small intestine. The kidneys, interestingly enough, also release erythropoietin, EPO. Now, this is a hormone which stimulates red blood cell production in the bone marrow. Now, here, if you take a look at where the kidneys are, of course, you have the descending aorta. You have the inferior vena cava going by, so that's the venous flow of blood. This is the arterial blood. The kidneys have a rich blood supply supported for them. Above them is the adrenal glands, and actually, as one surgeon told me, removing the adrenal gland, if they were doing a removal of a kidney, is a piece of cake because it's almost like a fatty layer. You just pull it right off, it peels right off, and you can leave it right there. Now, notice that you have adrenal arteries that come in here. They're going to be necessary to take away the hormones that are produced by the adrenal glands. If you look at the adrenal glands, you have the outer layer, which is the adrenal capsule. Then you start going through the cortex, which is consisting of 3 layers. The zona glomerulosa, they'll be somewhat rounded, okay? The zona fasciculata, which is almost like columns. And then you have the zona reticularis. Now, the reticularis is almost a netting meshing. Underneath that, look how the cells are different here from these. These are the chromaffin cells for the adrenal medulla. These are the cells making norepinephrine and epinephrine. The endocrine organs of the abdominal pelvic cavity include the reproductive organs. Now, we'll go into more of the reproductive system later on in the course, but we need to get familiarized with some of the endocrine functions right now. The reproductive organs control the development and maturation of sex cells, and what I mean by that is gametes, egg, sperm. They maintain accessory sex organs and support secondary sexual characteristics. The ovaries are located on the lateral walls of the pelvic cavity. They are the primary sex organs of the female and produce female sex hormones called estrogens. The testes are located in the scrotum. They are the primary sex organs of the males, and they produce the male sex hormones, which are generally classified as androgens. But the key one of this group is called testosterone. Here you see the male reproductive system, and you see down here where the testes are, the scrotum would be right here. And here you see the female reproductive system with the fallopian tubes and the ovaries right here. Now, we're going to move from gross anatomical structures to microscopic anatomy. First, we're going to start off with the pituitary gland. The common features of endocrine gland cells are the cells are usually cuboidal or polyhedral, that is many-sided, with large spherical nuclei. The cells are arranged in clusters, small islands, or cords. They have an extensive blood supply. Why? Because they need a good exchange of blood for oxygen, nutrients, removal of waste, and also not only the delivery of the precursor materials that would make up the hormones, but basically for the export of the hormones to various other tissues in the body. Now, the anterior lobe of the pituitary, which we talked about, is referred to as the adenohypophysis. It is glandular. It is consisting of glandular epithelial cells arranged in cords or clusters with a well-defined nuclei. The posterior lobe, the neurohypophysis, is neural. Most regions consist of axons that originate in neuron cell bodies from the hypothalamus. The pars intermedia is a narrow band of tissue in the anterior or next to the anterior lobe. Interestingly enough, it's active in the fetus, young children, and pregnant women. That is where these individuals see this production of MSH, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, and it plays a role in the function of stimulating melanocytes to make melanin, etc. Yet in most adults, this section is inactive. Here's the pars intermedia. Here's the posterior lobe. Here's the infundibulum. This is the more glandular structure here. This is the anterior lobe. Okay? And what you see are folds in the dura mater that keep this pretty much held together in the sella turica. Okay, here is an up-close image, and you can see the neurohypophysis. It's more neural. You'll see more lightly stained structures. You see this in-between patch of tissue here, the pars intermedia. And then you have the adenohypophysis, and you'll see basically cells that are much more darker staining, rounder, much more profound nuclei that you can see there, etc. They're actively producing hormones. Now, the microscopic anatomy of other endocrine organs, next off, we're going to go with the thyroid and the parathyroid glands. The thyroid consists of numerous follicles. Now, these are follicles that are surrounded by a single layer of cuboidal follicular cells. And inside of this follicle is, inside the cavity, it's filled with thyroglobulin. And it is this material that is where you're going to get the T3 and T4 synthesized and released. The synthesis uses the amino acid tyrosine, which forms these dimers of tyrosine, and then you have the iodide ions that are attached onto it. Now, in between the follicles are going to be another unique set of cells called parafollicular cells, C cells. They may call them chief cells or clear cells. They definitely stain differently than the thyroid follicular cells. But these C cells are extremely important because they produce calcitonin. The cells are located in tight clusters between follicles and have a pale or lightly stained cytoplasm and a large nuclei. Here you can see a clear cell, C cell. Here you see the cells that are simple cuboidal epithelium that form this boundary. And inside of the boundary is the thyroid follicle with thyroglobulin. Basically, you're going to have blood vessels that will deliver iodide, amino acids, and of course the typical glucose and oxygen, take away waste such as carbon dioxide, etc. And what's going to happen is from the cells, you're going to have the importation of the tyrosine and the iodide ions that will eventually form T3, T4. Remember that these clear cells here and you may see a few others such as right here, etc. They're kind of like filling in gaps, but they are extremely important in calcium ion regulation in the blood. After this, we're going to move into the parathyroid glands. Now, the parafollicular cells, the C cells for chief cells, produce calcitonin. This is the remnant of basically the thyroid. But interestingly enough, the cells that I've mentioned to you before, you now getting into the parathyroid gland, you're going to find that you have oxyphil cells. And these are only seen in human parathyroid cells. They occur singly or in clusters. The parafollicular cells of the parathyroid glands are present. They're larger. The oxyphil cells are larger than C cells and fewer in number than C cells and a lighter staining, but they have no known function. So here's what you have, and it may seem a little bit confusing there, but look at parathyroid cells. You can see the dark staining nuclei. They're referred to also as principal cells. And then what you have is a central blood vessel here, so supplying and taking away the nutrients. And then every once in a while you get this larger cell here, if you can see it right here, lightly stained, larger cytoplasm, but it's like it's on vacation. It doesn't do much. The parathyroid cells are all over the place here, and this is part of the parathyroid gland. Now, what about the pancreas and the adrenal gland? Well, the pancreas will consist of the acini, which is the cluster of cuboidal cells arranged around the central lumen that produce digestive enzymes. Acini are part of the exocrine function. The pancreatic islets are endocrine clusters of lighter staining cells. Remember that pancreatic islets, the other name for them is the islets of Langerhans. And you can't see by just looking at them whether they're alpha, beta, delta, or F cells. Sometimes they also call them PP cells. But if you use certain immunohistochemistry, where basically you take the tissue, you stain for specific proteins with antibodies, etc., you're going to be able to identify the alpha cells that produce glucagon, the beta cells produce insulin, the delta cells produce somatostatin. PP cells, otherwise known as F cells, produce pancreatic polypeptide. Now, you're going to be held responsible for that? Yes, in the sense that you would need to know what cells produce what hormones. Hint, hint. Here is a pancreatic islet. Now, all of these here are acini, plural acinis. But you notice how they're darker. The pancreatic islet kind of stands out here, distinct, because it doesn't take up the stain. They're faded almost. But these clusters here contain alpha, beta, delta, and F cells. Okay. Now, with the adrenal gland, we have the adrenal gland divided into the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. The cortex is divided into zones or layers that we call them zonas. And they differ in structure because they're involved with different types of steroid synthesis. The zona glomerulosa, the ZG, is outermost layer. It's covered by connective tissue. That's the outer membrane that kind of holds together the entire gland, okay? The outermost layer is connective tissue. But the ZG synthesizes mineralocords, particularly one that's called aldosterone. The zona fasciculata, the ZF, is the middle layer. The cells are larger, more lightly stained than ZG, and they synthesize glucocorticoids, one best known, cortisol. The zona reticularis, ZR, is innermost layer, so it borders the adrenal medulla. But this ZR synthesizes androgens. And then we get to the inner core, the medulla. It has an extensive capillary network, and it is stimulated by sympathetic neural stimulation to release epinephrine, norepinephrine at a 4-to-1 ratio. If you take a look by this diagram here, you see where the outer capsule, that's the connective tissue, then you go through the layers of the cortex, and then you have the medulla. Notice the large number of blood vessels. So, adrenal capsule, zona glomerulosa, ZG, producing mineralocords. Zona fasciculata, much different, kind of like straight lines here. Columns, they produce the glucocorticoids. Finally, the zona reticularis, this rete of netting, this produces the androgens. And then, of course, we've got a very different staining structure here of the adrenal medulla, which produces epinephrine, norepinephrine. And you can see this also with a much more enhanced microscopic image, the capsule, the glomerulosa, the fasciculata, the reticularis, and then the medulla. Okay? The fasciculata, they're organized in kind of like little bundles. The reticularis is net-like in appearance. And a lot of these up in the glomerulosa, they'll be like globular or round structures. Okay, so what do you have to do for your lab activity? Again, mind you that this has been modified for your online learning. So here's what we want you to do. Go over the images in the PowerPoint and go over the images in your exercise. Review the images for locating the gross anatomy as well as the microscopic anatomy of the endocrine organs of head, neck, thoracic cavity, and abdominopelvic cavity. Okay? You want to review the microscopic and anatomical images. Those are the microscopic slides that they have the pictures of in your text. You want to be able to complete the worksheet, which is going to be as a PDF in the Blackboard, and you will have the time to basically get it all set up and get it all done by Friday of this week. Okay? It is important that you fill it out completely. It's a PDF form, so basically if you put your mouse over and click onto the particular line, you can then type in the answers. All right? Also, I've included some lab videos, and I encourage you to review those. They are also located in the same section of that unit for this particular week. Have a nice day.